Okay, here we are live. Welcome everyone to ISO Break version 24, Count Every Breath, a climate change anthology reading. I should say good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you in whatever time zone you're tuning in from. I'm Tim Tomlinson. I'm a founder of New York Writers Workshop and the director of the program. And ISO Break is a reading series co-hosted by New York Writers Workshop and Asia Pacific Writers and Translators. We're a pair of like-minded literary organizations on two different parts of the planet. We partner up for various enterprises. And as the evening goes on, I'll be taking a moment here and there to say one thing or another about what New York Writers Workshop is up to for the calendar year, and the same for Asia Pacific Writers and Translators. I want to also mention that ISO Break is a program hatched from the fertile brain of our co-member Ravi Shankar, the poet memoirist, and I hope Ravi is out in the audience somewhere as I fill his very large sandals. He came up with ISO Break as a way to combat isolation during the lockdown. And the series has been so successful that it's going to continue through all the catastrophes of humanity, which we can be sure will continue for us, sadly. And let's see. So tonight's session is devoted to Count Every Breath, a climate change anthology, edited by poet Vinita Agrawal, published by Hawakal Publishers of New Delhi and Calcutta. Vinita will be reading a bit later, and she'll talk more about eco-poetics and the anthology. For now, I want to limit my comments on those topics to these. About the difference between nature writing and eco-poetry, the American poet Forrest Gander says, "Nature poetry often takes for its themes the so-called natural world, as though it were separate from the human world. Eco-poetry asks how we are involved in and a part of all that surrounds us." Mm-hmm. And maybe we can dig into that idea as we move through the evening. About the work in this volume, the Singaporean writer Esther Vincent Shuiming says, "As we read this anthology in the context of the wider discourse on climate change, let us ask ourselves how eco-poetry might spark in us a subversive ecstasy." I love that idea, a subversive ecstasy. I hope we wind up like that at the end of the evening. No violence encouraged, but all sorts of other things welcome. So tonight's readers are contributors to the volume, and they are Mary Newell, Paul DaCosta, Tom Doig, Pervin Saket, and Vinita Agrawal. They'll read in that order, and I'll introduce each as they come on. After everyone's read, we'll follow up with some Q&A, and we welcome comments and questions from you in the global audience. Please do say hello in the chats and let us know where you're writing in from. I'm seeing so much activity in the chat already, and I see we have successfully made the world a bit smaller. We have Australia saying hello to Los Angeles. That's great. Okay, so to get us going, we're going to start with the poet, editor, educator, Mary Newell. Mary is the author of the poetry chapbooks Resurge on Trainwreck Press and Tilt Hover Veer. She's the co-editor of the phenomenal anthology Poetics for the More Than Human World, an anthology of poetry and commentary, which is available on Amazon. Maybe Mary can pop the link up at a certain point. Highly recommend this volume. And she'll also talk about a new book coming soon called The Rutledge Companion to Eco-Poetics. And I'm delighted to introduce Mary to our audience. Mary, take it away.
Thank you, Tim, and welcome everyone, whatever time zone you're in. I'm on the East Coast, so it's getting late here, but I'm really happy to be sharing this time with all of you. I'm going to read three poems that really are quite different in and timbre, different aspects of ecopoetics. The first, you might say, begins from a kind of naive personal perspective, and then under pressure enlarges the view somewhat. And this is the poem that's in the anthology, and it's called Well in the Country. We're well in the country, probably properly called exurbs. We have a well. Well, it's my first well, so I thought, a bit of independence from bureaucracy for that basic need. But no, wells need electricity to power their pumps, so we're still on the grid. Joke's on me. No water during blackouts unless you saved buckets of water to flush. It works. I did. But when the novelty wears off, you buy a generator to make up for all that money you saved moving from the city. We were well-welled. Good news. In the basement where the water comes in, 2 blue tanks filter out excess iron that seeps down from the copper mine. You knew, perhaps, the copper ore is not pure copper, but a mix. Ours is a copper-sulfur-iron compound, calciparite. Filtering works, except for that interval before the generator kicks on when random particles could get in the water, so it has to be flushed. Well, we exult in life in the exurbs, and all is well, except for the water pressure, a dribble. I didn't see this coming, this glitch called drought. My first. My neighbor says it's not the worst. A garden friend consoles. Don't feel bad, everyone's plants are dying. Conjuring future famine, I water at 5 to beat the showering crowd. Next, the water table sinks. The well slows to a near stall stuffed with irony muck. And then a huge truck brings a plunging surger, and several thousand later we have water for every modest need, and all will be well with the well. All well in the world? Well. My second poem is part of a series that was published in Blaze Box, and this part is about communication with or by other species, and it's called List to the Leaves. List to the leaves rustling, listen in. Our chlorize trap sun vigor, slide liquefied sunlight down tiny channels into a larger stream, root drawn. Treasures we trade for hydration. We brandish viridian so you can flow ruddy. We leaf. When our cells reverberate, we swivel into calyx wrap to foster buds and wrap our cousins' stretching glory. We honor each phase, the bud's slow or swift unfolding. After, when flower petals splay, still aromatic, we revive our offering, entice sunlight, exhale your breath food. We give back, go back to ground, transmogrify. We don't fear falling to clay. Once we dissolve to elementals, the roots can take us up again. This brief wafting, our wing. And so the third poem that I'm going to read was published in my second chapbook, Research, which is, the publisher is out of business. If anyone is really eager to have a copy, I will send a PDF on request. And it's also, in a way, a paean to water in a more global context. Adrift in undrinkable waters. And the quote in the beginning is from Angela Merkel. Between words and deeds, there is a sea. As a toddler in search of starfish, A riptide almost carried me away. Safe arms surrounded tumbling hollers. Almost is a long way from drowning. Sand in the mouth, sea vomit, limbs flailing, then home to lap of comfort. Distant calamities trouble calm. Attempted rescues, urgencies, salt, famish, heat stroke, top size, ocean swallows without a burp. Arms can't reach through a newscast to help those stripped from homeland who risk the turbulent vault. The ocean tantalizes, seduced by its rhythmic pulse. I forget undertow, dead zones, toxic cargo, permutating cells. Thank you. I'm going to stop there and hope to continue later in conversation.
Mary, thanks so much. Beautiful work, great start. I'm happy to hear you conclude with the poem about the ocean. This is where my heart lies. I'm a scuba diver, and I check in on the news every day with great sadness. You might know that the water in Florida is over 101 degrees right now, which is close to 40 C. And the corals in Florida are bleaching and dying, and probably nowhere near the scale of catastrophe on the Great Barrier Reef. So we are in so much trouble, and it doesn't end at the shore. We'll pick up at that as we go forward. Hello, everyone. You're watching ISO Break version 24. This is the Count Every Breath Climate Change Showcase. I'm Tim Tomlinson, and I'm hosting for New York Writers Workshop in collaboration with Asia Pacific Writers and Translators. The next big thing going on with APWT is a 7-day retreat in Bali. If you go to apwriters.org, you can take a look at what's planned and what isn't planned, because I think it's going to be largely a self-directed retreat. I love APWT. I love Bali. I love the people of the big community. Highly recommend checking that out and getting a little bit of time with these people in that place. Next up, we have Michelle DaCosta. Michelle will be coming in. Tell us where you're coming in from, Michelle.
I'm from Bombay.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's early morning here.
Okay, very good. So I'm in LA, where we just went to Baltimore. Now we're going to Bombay, and we have Michelle DaCosta. She's the author of the poetry chapbook Gulf on Yavaninka Press, and the co-host of the author interview podcast, Books and Beyond with Bound. Ladies and gentlemen, Michelle DaCosta.
Hi, everyone. So glad to be here. And it's sort of a really interesting segue, after Mary's poem about, being in search of a starfish. So my poem is about collecting shells. It's called The Exploitative Art of Collecting Shells. And I'm reading it out from the book here. I have the anthology with me. I run on the soft bed of sand to book my spot on the hard rock, which lets sea creatures cling onto it like leeches. My footprints won't last. No one will know I was here. I want to find the best for my collection, where Anjuna will meet Girgaon, Asri, and Mulki. Safely parked on the rock, I trace the shape of a snail's shell, dark brown with bright orange stripes. The snail refuses to leave, even after multiple attempts of forced eviction. The waves watch with vengeful eyes reserved for tourists. They nudge my feet calmly at first. The waves watch with vengeful eyes, reserved for tourists. They nudge my feet calmly at first. When I grip the shell tighter, they recede and then ambush me, taking the snail along to where it belongs. So I was inspired to write this poem after a recent trip to Anjuna, Goa. And as usual, because I love collecting shells, it was just a routine sort of act for me. And when I returned from the trip, I just sort of Googled what is the right way to preserve shells, right? And that's when I came upon a lot of articles about how it's not really right to collect even empty shells, right? So, as opposed to the poem that you heard me read out, it's even harmful to collect shells which are empty, right? I mean, and I never really thought of it. Like, why would we think about that, right? Like, these are just empty shells on the seashore. It should be pretty harmless, but it isn't, right? So my aim with this poem is to sort of, tell others that sometimes it's okay to let things be, right? I think as humans, we have this urge to sort of fiddle with things around us, fiddle with nature. I think this is just a small reminder that it's okay to let things be, let alone going out of the way to sort of rectify the damage that has been done. We all sort of know, the impending climate crisis and the sort of, really harmful effects we have sort of done over the years. But I think just letting things be sometimes is okay. And I would just urge all of our viewers today to sort of read more upon the kind of effects that's been happening around us. And I'm just currently reading this book, and I'd like to recommend people to read more books like this. It's called Heavy Metal. It's about the mercury poisoning of Kodaikanal. So I think that's it. um, Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. That's such an interesting issue. I think we go to various locations innocently, not recognizing the damage we may inflict. This is something that comes up a lot when I go scuba diving and people are slathering on the sunscreen, which of course comes off in the water, and the fish don't need it and the corals don't like it. So many things we need to be conscious of when we move into new environments out of our own zone. So thank you very much. Do you have the shell?
No, after that enlightening encounter, I went to the beach and emptied all my entire collection that I had built over the years.
Beautiful. That would have made an interesting video and maybe a way to enlighten others. Thank you so much. Okay, so
Thank you.
back with the interim parts of the show. You're watching ISO Break version 24, Count Every Breath, a climate change showcase, co-hosted by New York Writers Workshop and Asia Pacific Writers and Translators. I'm Tim Tomlinson of New York Writers Workshop. The next thing we have going on in New York is the sessions we do at the New York Public Library. They are for free. They start at the end of August and they'll run through September in, I think, 5 different branches. And appropriately enough, the library has asked us this time to do workshops on what they're calling nature writing. So I'll be doing one in September. Ravi Shankar will be doing one also in September, I think up in the Bronx. And we have several other poets and writers scattering around the boroughs to do nature writing workshops for free at New York Public Library. You can find that information on our website soon. I think it's already posted on the NYPL sites. So next we move to Tom Doig. And Tom is a writer from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Yeah, almost, right? I've been practicing. I knew I was going to blow it, but I wanted to give it a stab. New Zealand, living in Meanjin, Brisbane, author of Hazelwood, The Coalface, Moron to Moron, Two Men, Two Bikes, One Mongolian Misadventure, and editor of Living with the Climate Crisis, Voices from Aotearoa. And Tom will say that correctly when he comes on. Welcome, Tom Doig.
Kia ora koutou, kia ora koutou, kia ora koutou katoa, and kia ora te whanau. Ko Tom Doig toku ingoa. Yeah, so I'm ko Ngāti Pākehā toku iwi. My name's Tom. I'm a settler colonist. I grew up in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Congratulations, Venita, on this collection. I'd also like to acknowledge that I am beaming in from the traditional lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people. Sovereignty was never ceded, and pay my profound respects to their ancestors and elders, and pay my respects to any Indigenous people listening in. So I'm going to read a poem that I wrote for Venita's great collection, Count Every Breath. It's called Dear Valued Guest. Dear valued guest, listed below as information, and immigrants flocked to your imperial nugget of wisdom. Discontented trees turn to pulp. Winter at the bottom of muddy lakes. Please call hotel reception for badly written email, a startling ruby, churn of worms. But what about the rust of farming equipment, the unknown amounts of chemical substances, just dying to be displayed in your bachelor pad, your sick man cave? You will be notified of changes to the life and death cycle of the average QR code, while others concluded that the white chemist polluted the air for nostalgic reasons. Or have you already given up on humanity's ability to oxygen? The blues and greens of our thin spring sky read as semaphore, X, O, X. Tiny homes were dug out, as if they had just folded their wings. I'm going to read another poem in a similar vein called Something Very Old, which was published on Cordite a couple of years ago. Inner monologues are set forth in North America from deserts to mountaintops in cutting room fashion, measures between 2 and 3 feet in length, runs hot and cold, active only at night. They feed principally on the difference between a pond and a lake, a haircut and a beheading. Digs shallow burrows, blowing my nose and lying in bed with my shoes on. Settling into the new apartments in combination with fleas, larger than mice, grabs her shoulders and plants a kiss on her cheek, their faces and buttocks marked with vivid purples and reds, precisely because we are human. Having no technical meanings, improvising his own plan, seemingly on a daily basis, something very old, of which we have not freed and may never free ourselves. The decimated populations in 29 minutes, and the NBC broadcast it in full, unedited, including its tail. Flashing back to the leaf mold of the forest floors, with scant regard for chronology, between molds and shrews. Yet it also covered terrain as if we're old friends, and it occurs to me that maybe we are. So that's actually the first time I've read either of those poems out loud, and it felt quite strange because they're not in my voice. They're collage poems I made from various sources. So the one in Venita's anthology, Dear Valued Guest, I actually wrote while I was in managed isolation quarantine in a Brisbane hotel room, having just moved over here, and they sent this really weird anonymous letter, or in that kind of bureaucratic language, and I cut it up and mixed it with some text from the London Review of Books, and I guess always looking for phrases that capture a kind of end of the world ambience. But it's not my words, but the way they fall together is it's the phrases that are interesting to me. I sort of see Dear Valued Guest as a sort of poem about ecological collapse, and that using pre-existing words, I find that somehow easier or more powerful personally. I can't really write about eco stuff in the first person without it just feeling a little bit like, for me personally, something that fails to do justice to it, or something that I haven't heard 100 times before. Whereas letting things fall out of the collage is the way the way I go with it. So maybe that's something we can pick up more in the conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you for bringing that up. I mean, I've been thinking about the connection between the aesthetic impulse, the idea of making something significant and beautiful at the same time that you are working with such disturbing material. What's the relationship between activism and literary aspiration, and how do you finally navigate that? So I loved what you did, and I'm glad that you bring up the issue, and we most certainly will get back to it as we go through the evening. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next reader, but first I'll just remind everybody that you're watching ISO Break version 24, Count Every Breath, the Climate Change Showcase, hosted by New York Writers Workshop and Asia Pacific Writers and Translators. I want to recommend also considering the conference coming up in 2024, the next big convocation of APWT, which brings in people from all over the world, North America, South America, Europe, and of course the Asia Pacific region. And this time the conference will be held in, I'm going to just go straight to NZ, New Zealand, and hopefully Tom will be over there and doing some work with pronunciation and familiarization. That's going to be, I think, in November 2024. I'm not 100% certain of dates yet, but please do check the apwriters.org website for updates. And you can probably get lots of updates if you go to Bali in October. Okay, so let's move now to Pervin Sackett. Pervin is the winner of the Srinivas Rayapal Poetry Prize from 2021. Author of the novel Urmila, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and the poetry collection A Tinge of Turmeric. Pervin is poetry editor of the Bombay Literary Magazine and co-founder of the annual, let's go back to the notes, Kolam Writers Workshop. And that's a new name for a venerated how would you say, organization. So let's go to Pervin. Welcome to ISO Break.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. And thank you for all the wonderful ways in which you've been contextualizing our reading and our talk today. And Mary, Michelle, Tom, what a wonderful environment you've provided to me with your readings, allowing my poems to immediately be in conversation with the ones that you've read for us. And I think I speak for everyone, thanking Vinita for shepherding this anthology and taking something that is, of course, important, but also making it imaginative, inventive, and graceful. And I was going through so many poems here, and I can see that there's a reason why in these pages the poems are not heavy-handed. They're not slogans. The concerns of our world have been shaped into these very artistic, compelling narratives. And I can see Vinita's sensibility shine through all of that. And before I read a couple of poems, I do want to take a moment to recognize this gentleness, this lightness, even the humor that coexists in these poems, alongside the call for change. In fact, I'd like to begin by reading a very short poem in translation that illustrates this idea. It is called Butterflies, and it is written by Hemant Devate in Marathi, and it's been translated into English by Dilip Chitre. And it goes like this. Butterflies. Strolling around in the garden of our complex, I asked my friend casually, "Hey, how come we do not see those deep yellow small butterflies these days?" So he replied coolly, "Oh, that brand has been discontinued." And Tim, since you mentioned that scuba diving is close to your heart, It's wonderful that the other poem I planned to read is by the brilliant Indian poet Kunjana Parasar, and her poem is called Acoustic Enrichment. It says, for 6 weeks, a group of scientists placed an underwater loudspeaker in a desolate reef. It played a recording of crackles, pops, snaps, fish grunts, and choruses. The aim was to replicate the sonorous din of healthy coral habitat, to see if the fish could be lured by an orchestrated tune resembling the reverb of home. And perhaps they could restore all such reefs dying of marine heat waves with the medicine of music. And so they played the song, and they waited. And the fish came back to the rubble following the sun of sounds, lush and plural, just like that. Can you imagine? They swam this way back, the damselfish. So came back the whole community, eaters of plant, plankton, crustacean, other fish, all of them. A recovery across the whole trophic guild. And doesn't it boggle the mind that in the stone of their years lies hidden the coded memory of an ambient track? Crackle, pop, snap. A choral song of shrimp, codpod, triton, parrotfish, whale. That once the propellers are off and the engines asleep, in the deep oral zones of water, all creatures await the thump of a collective drumbeat, hair cells waving. That we need something to keep us well beyond the singular wreck of our quiet groan. The constant tick of a metronome, a lodestar, a blue concert, something to keep us here, tethered, a bridge, a background score of cicadas, faint welding, a cackle of girls cycling down the Tekri, the static of rain falling in low fidelities, which for some, like me, is its own kind of home. And finally, I'll read my poem, which I find that eco-poetics is very it's very interesting in how it breaks two insular spaces. One, which, like you mentioned, Tim, this idea that the environment is separate from the human, the political, the linguistic, the social. It insists on relationships and interdependencies. And the other, where poetry, particularly some contemporary poetry, appears to be cut off from those who don't work in poetry themselves. We increasingly see that consumers of poetry are other poets, that we're writing to each other and therefore more and more in a coded aesthetic. But in a space like this, with an urgent and immediate crisis at its heart, with its inherent need to reach out and connect and inspire, to me, that is the second and no less remarkable ambition of eco-poetry. So this is what I explore in this second poem, in this third poem, my relationship as a writer to these situations of our times. It's called Too Much Faith. Suppose you decide to write a poem about the coming of spring. You consider little things like the lilies near the creek you pretend is a river. But you're done with garnish and gimmick. You need a verse with such truth it can reverse melting glaciers and freezing sanctions, resurrect forests back into surprised green, and list each ancestor of the last rhino. So you begin to write about the promise of a new age. But the slogans of the young suggest they've been the old of another time. The page smells of soot and metal and 1938. You decide to work your way towards the quiet treasures of soil and dirt, but you need to escape unchecked mining, at least in this poem. You return to images of children passing pamphlets on the streets and women greeting riot police with roses. But you wish the world no longer needed that kind of strength. You once declared that art can heal, but your fingers are now calloused. You might start lush, fertile odes to tadpoles, but your lines are desolate, your pauses nettles. So you declare that your ink is running out of breath, that there are others, please. And yet, when once again the summer is too late, too long, too much, and the world is drooping on its own axis, and this time your grandmother's village is submerged, a thatched roof swept away, you find yourself reaching for this prana of 26 letters, choosing vowels and seeds, hoping you haven't placed too much faith in words. Thank you.
Wow, beautiful work, Pervin. I'm seeing a comment in the thread asking for the details of the second poem that you read. Everybody can get the third poem that you read when you get your copy of Count Every Breath. I'm familiar with some of the studies being done on sound at the coral reef. And, you know, when you lose diversity in the reef, you lose the stereophonic norm, and it depletes the intrigue of the reef for its citizens, and they move on. But so interesting and so beautiful that you can attract them back by playing the full sound of a coral reef. Another one of the amazing things that one encounters looking at nature and going underwater. Thank you so much for including that. Well, now we're going to move on to our final reader of the evening, Vinita Agrawal, who's the editor of this fantastic anthology that everybody's been reading from and citing. And Vinita might take a moment or two to tell us a little bit more about the conception of the volume and the work that went into it. But let me introduce to you Vinita. Her latest collection of poems is Twilight Language. That was the winner of the Proverse Prize Hong Kong 2021. She has authored 5 books of poetry. She was awarded the Rabindranath Tagore Literary Prize 2018 and the Gayatri Gamarsh Memorial Award for Literary Excellence 2015. She is the poetry editor at Usawa, and we're so happy to welcome Vinita to ISOBreak. Vinita, I think I need to unmute you. There you go.
Thank you, Tim. So, Tim, firstly, thank you for hosting this very important and very significant session on climate change and showcasing the anthology, Count Every Breath. And it's heartwarming to note that not only are you hosting it for us, but your heart is in it too, that you care about these issues, these matters, and it concerns you that the corals in Florida, in the beaches of Florida, in the Sea of Florida are getting bleached, and all those issues related to that you mentioned earlier. And thank you very much, Mary Newell, Michelle DeCosta, Tom Doig, and Pervin Saket for making time to be a part of this reading. Thank you for reading your wonderful work, and thank you for the wonderful reading itself. And thank you for speaking about these issues in ways that matter, in ways that will sensitize the people who are listening to us or may listen to this telecast later on, or who may pick up the anthology and read the poems that are going to give away these these little nudges that are the very important, significant nudges to the reader's mind, so that they get sensitized to this very, very important issue. I took 2 years to put this together, but before this, I had put together another anthology that was called Open Your Eyes, and it was received very well. It got a lot of critical reviews and it did rather well, and I was encouraged because, one anthology on climate change is not enough to make a difference to the literary scene. This is a kind of a literary activism, as we all know. So I was prompted to put together the second anthology, which is what we are discussing right now, the Climate Count Every Breath. And that was, the focus was on getting more international voices to this anthology. Of course, most of them are from India, about 20 or 35 contributors are Indian and 20 are from the international areas, from USA, Australia, and Europe and other places. So it's very important that even right now we have Tom Doig, who's a voice from Australia and New Zealand, which is a different area from where we live, and where in America these things are discussed much more, but we're not really that much keyed into what's happening in the other continents. So it took 2 years, like I was saying, and then the precursor to this was that first anthology, Open Your Eyes. And I felt that getting people from different areas of the world would, reflect their poetic voices, their expressions, and their expressions would be born from their experiences and what they've noticed is going wrong with our environment, with the earth. So I thank you all for contributing. I thank everybody who is not even on this panel for contributing their marvelous work to the anthology and making it what it is. And Tom, you raised a very important point about nature poetry versus eco poetry. And also, Tim raised this point, and he quoted Forrest Gander on that. And Tom raised this important point about collaging, various bits of information into poems and not writing it just in his own pure voice. And I'd like to say here that eco poetry is a great opportunity to bring science to poetry. So we don't need to put it down as very factual, but we do need to make it creative so that it touches hearts. That's the main thing, the sensitivity and the ability to reach into the reader's heart and tell them and explain to them about how things are going wrong and what is going wrong with this entire environment and ecology, and how we cannot ignore it. It's actually leading to species extinction, which is something that really cuts into my heart. That's one effect of the entire climate change that is really, really very, very serious, apart from many other serious things. So this anthology has poems on, the plastic residue and plastic pollution. It has poems on various landscapes disappearing from our planet. It also has speculative poetry where a great mountain like Mount Everest may disappear. It may be under the sea in a few years from now. That kind of speculative poetry is there. It has poems on the changing seasons. It has poems on trees, and Michelle's poem on shells. I remember I had this back and forth with Michelle when she contributed her poem. I was wondering if it was really such a serious issue, but then she gave me clippings of articles that showed that, this is something that is damaging the basic structure of those beaches. So it was very nice to have that poem from her. There are poems on landslides and water quality and what have you. So I thought I would, in fact, talk more about the anthology and just read my poem and also a one short poem by Laura Wisniewski, who's from America. I'll read Laura's poem first. At the edge of Lake Memphremagog, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly. At the edge of Lake Memphremagog, I watched a catfish swim in South Bay. Near the spill, gills flush, whiskers reaching out, delighting in deep murk, in the clutter of plastic forks and mussels, minnow clouds, milfoil, the treasures of green water, as I that day, not yet mortal, delighted in her swirl, our cancers would come later. I'd like to read my own poem here. This is actually a true incident. In 2021, I had gone to Leh, Ladakh, which is the northern area of Kashmir. And there was a farmer there who was, in Kashmir, in that area, farmers normally grow fruits like apricots and plums and those winter fruits. And their entire yearly income depends on one crop, and that crop is an annual crop. So if that crop is spoiled or gets rotten, they lose the entire year's worth of earning. And this farmer was actually crying because I'll narrate the incident through the poem itself. It's called The Central Asian Flyway and the Apricot Farmer of Ladakh. In Hanuthang, some miles north of Ladakh, a blood and bones farmer surveys open-mouthed this year's mound of apricot crop, rotten and decayed, devoured by aphids and mealybugs. Months of tending, watering, nurturing, pruning, giving, reduced to mush by pests. His death fossil of a back broken. He surveys the loss with one hand on his heart, the other twirling rosary beads. His breath shaken, he eagerly awaits an avian army to come to his rescue. 2 months into summer, when the apricots turn sienna gold and succulent, he scans the horizon for birds, thrushes and plovers, stints and wheat eaters. They haven't flown in this season. Insects have flourished. Cirques of clean-shaven mountains spread their arms out wide as if they own the planet, but not a bird in sight. Spring migration has succumbed to rising temperatures. The sky gazes unblinkingly at itself in hushed mirror lakes. The Central Asian Flyway stares self-consciously into the farmer's watery eyes. As a postscript, may I just share that the farmer actually depends on these birds to come in and devour the insects so that the insects don't get to the fruits. But because of global warming, because the winter is less severe now in those areas, then the birds don't come at that particular month, in that particular month, and when they should come and the apricots ripen. And because they can't get there at the right time, the insects make a meal of the farmer's crop. And it's extremely, and this is not a local phenomenon, it's happening all over the world in different ways with different crops. So I look forward to an active question and answer session. And let's talk about this more. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you so much, Vinita. Again, so many interesting ideas and material emerging from your encounter. Before the group got together, I was talking to Mary, and I had mentioned a recent article that appeared in the New Yorker by Jonathan Franzen, who's become something of a birder. He spends a lot of time looking at birds and reading about birds and editing anthologies about birds. He's really got the bug. And he wrote a wonderful piece about what he was calling nature writing. I don't think in the midst of this article he ever uses the term eco-poetics, and maybe that's because he's attempting to stay away from terminology that might be targeting a niche audience and instead trying to appeal to a larger one. But he said a few things in there that I thought were really provocative, and I'm hearing echoes of his ideas in this discussion. And maybe we can just open it up by one of them that Mary and I talked about briefly, which was his idea that it's not enough to write about nature because writing about nature in and of itself will not appeal to the reader, that the reader instead wants narrative, and that narrative involves humans. And in your piece, Vanita, you had the story of the farmer, and there's that component to your piece. How does this intersect with what you guys are up to? How do you feel about the notion of writing about nature through the lens of a human experience? How critical is that?
Can I take that?
Sure.
Yeah, there's this whole question that I'm always bombarded with, that is it really going to make a difference if we write about these things? Is it really going to make a difference? This is not activism on the streets. So how are you going to cure these issues that you're bringing up through writing, through your poetry and other means? And I want to quote Seamus Heaney and Czesław Miłosz, if I'm pronouncing the name correctly, because they've also said this thing that poetry can't stop tanks, but it can sensitize people to the repercussions of war. So to draw a parallel in the same way, as long as you at least know about these things and know how to make changes in your life. Of course, the larger issue is that we need to tackle capitalism. That's the real enemy. But at least if everybody makes small changes in their lives and lives more consciously, it is going to make a difference to your environment. And at least you'll have a more conscience that's more at peace with itself. And so that's how I look at it. And I'd like others also to respond.
Yeah, I'd like to say, I mean, I can't disagree with Franzen, but I think that we should stretch that a little bit, because I think that still leans on the idea, this sort of, Western idea of the individual as a really bounded, separate identity. And so I think story making, narrative is a part of most cultures, right? It has a vitality, a communal vitality, but I don't think it has to be an individual in an environment. It can be a group, it can be a sharing, and more it can be a sense of permeable boundaries where, the identity even of individual humans depends on other species as well. There's not this sense of boundaries in such a static kind of way. The sort of flow, the rhythms that were talked about that help the coral reefs, I think they help humans as well, right? We may not pay attention to them when we're preoccupied, but it's a really different background when there are birds singing and when there's, the static silence of the air conditioner or whatever.
Absolutely. Others?
I'd like to weigh in for a moment and just talk about how what I've noticed is so many of us talk about climate change and extinction and all of these ideas with respect to how it impacts human beings, how it impacts our lives, how it impacts our cities. And there is still that idea of nature as natural resource. We're not thinking of it as worthy of saving for itself, but for how we will benefit from it or how we will be damaged if nature is damaged. So that is also something that I think we need to. That is this human-centric perspective that we need to push ourselves out of this idea that we're at the top and nature is a resource, and saving nature will save human beings. So that's also something that I think we should be questioning a little bit.
Thanks, everyone. I think this is such an interesting question. I think about this a lot, not just with my poet hat on, because I don't go around calling myself a poet that much. Just because I do other writing, I write nonfiction, I teach it a lot. And one of the things that occurs to me listening to this is that, like I love that poem poem about playing the reef, the underwater music, and it coming back. And there's a form of poetry that can be very narrative driven and not that different from journalism, right? It can be in that nonfiction space, and you can do all of that work, and you can very much be doing the work of journalism, bearing witness, calling for advocacy or activism, all that stuff. That's what I do, or would like to be doing most of the time. But I also feel like poetry does all these other things that are much subtler and less rational or analytical, that are really important. In terms of poetry's relationship to meaning is much more slippery and dynamic and multiple. And so that's what I love in poetry in general, and then I guess in eco-poetics, is that you don't always know what a poem means, or it means lots of different things, or it means a different thing on a different day, different month, different year. And I think that for me personally, that's what my own poetic practice is about, is trying to sort of do something with the letting go of the world as it is now, and feeling grief about that, and staring at these quite apocalyptic futures. That isn't necessarily trying to fix it. So some of it I don't think can be fixed. But I think there's also something else going on there, which is just trying to feel things or experience them in different ways, because it's so complicated what we're going through, and it's so difficult to comprehend. And I think poetry just gives us additional ways to comprehend things. And the same could go for other non-linguistic art forms, right? Like painting and dance and so forth. Like they're doing all this other work which isn't necessarily discursive, and that's really important.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, yeah, I do think it's a very personal relationship that we all have with the environment, right? So I can't speak for others, but at least for me, whenever I approach this topic, whenever I seem to sort of gather my thoughts around it, there are these very difficult emotions that come to the surface, and it's always a human in the picture, right? Because I do think that humans hold a lot of power, and it is very scary what we do with that power, right? So I often grapple with those themes, and I do think that humans and the sort of effect that we have on the climate is sort of very, very vast, and that's why I think even a small nudge can go a long mile. Yeah.
Okay. I'm thinking about the poem about the shell, and remembering an experience I had on the island of Bonaire in the Caribbean many years ago. It raises an issue of intervention in natural environments. I did a workshop with a marine biologist called Touch the Sea. And in Bonaire, the ethos around being in the water is very strict. You're not allowed to go in with gloves. You're not allowed to have a dive stick. You're not allowed to touch anything, and they're constantly monitoring your buoyancy to make sure you don't bump into anything. And if you do, they'll either correct you or ask you to leave. So one of the things that they really stress is not touching anything. And yet this marine biologist brought us down, and the whole purpose of her workshop was to invite everyone to take off gloves and to actually touch various species. So we touched the surface of a number of different corals, we touched anemones, we touched a whole bunch of things, and it opened up a whole different world of experience, of understanding, familiarity with the reef. Is there anything in the current moment that's perhaps going too far with restrictions and restraints? Is there a way to, like, I remember on another occasion on the island of Jamaica, pointing out some object that was on a leaf. It turned out to be some kind of a slug, and the botanist that was walking us through the area smacked the bug off the leaf and stepped on it and crushed it dead. And my friend and I looked at each other like, oh my God, what a sacrilege we just witnessed. But the botanist was the botanist, and he knew the environment. I just throw that out there. Are we being too careful with our understanding of natural environments?
I don't think we could be careful enough, honestly. And in India, we are facing this tourism boom after the COVID, the solitariness and the isolation of COVID. People are traveling, but it's very important that they take care of the environment that they're visiting and not leave trash behind. And we need to have strict laws in place that ensure that nobody. There's a poem in the anthology, Preeti Vangani's poem, where she mentions that let me leave the earth better than as I found it, which just says it all. So, Tim, I don't think we can do enough with these regulations. We need to have them in place because sometimes we need to discipline, the masses. We need to have these rules in place so that they will adhere to them and not damage the environment that they're visiting.
I'm going to guess that's the prevailing opinion, it's one I share. Mary?
No, I was just going to say, and follow up to Tom saying that poetry can help people experience things in different ways, that I think it's important to go beyond a narrative that's just on the human scale because it keeps us in the center, in an authoritative way. And I think writing that addresses the ecology has to have a sense of scale, a time scale, or a creature scale, something, the different lifespans of different creatures in the tempo of the writing, and something to bring in this kind of multiplicity of voices, whether it's directly in dialogue or indirectly through the meter, through the organization on the page or something. Because we live in a world where many things are going on at the same time, right? And just to stick with one kind of storyline goes to a certain part of the mind, but it doesn't necessarily touch the whole, the whole of oneself. So how indirectly to sort of bring this, the feeling that, people are talking about, the conviction that would really change people's way of being in the world. I think that's part of the question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky, the question of like how and why do people care about nature, and how can we care about it without destroying it at the same time, right? So on one level, that paradox affects the middle classes of the global north and increasingly of the global south, which is like, do you have to fly to Antarctica and stomp around on it to think it's important? Hopefully the answer is no, because otherwise we all have to fly to Antarctica. But it's also true that those experiences can be so profound and life altering, and they have been for me. I haven't been to Antarctica, but I've time up mountains is the best time, and so forth. And I remember I can't remember who told me this. I was talking to someone and they were like, if everyone in the world was sort of forced as part of their life to spend sort of 1 week a year out in nature, sort of camping and living quite rustically, their supposition was that would actually transform society, right? That if everyone was doing that it would transform the way that, and I guess where would that transformation mainly occur is in the people who are actively involved in the wrecking industries, that maybe they'd think about it differently. So I think that's an interesting thought experiment, but I think it does butt up against the fact that some experiences of nature do create really big footprints, right? Like if there's a heap of travel involved, or if you're visiting, if the 8+ billion people on the planet all go to the wilderness, go to the cloud forests of Nicaragua just to make sure the tree frogs are important, like that's not going to work either.
Yeah. Yes.
Indeed.
Yeah, and so I feel that some sort of awareness is important, right? Like you said, Tim, there's a fine line between enjoying nature and sort of exploiting nature, and that's where the discipline comes in. But I do think that some sort of awareness is important, right? Because what often happens is we sort of take things for granted, right? I mean, no matter what we hear around us is just, news in the background. So I do think that if we sort of have some initiative where, let's say we visit a beach, right, in Bombay. So let's say it's Juhu Beach, one of the most crowded beaches in the most, happening areas of Bombay. If sort of like, there is some sort of notice or something that would, make us aware of, let's say, what is the sort of, pollution level of the water currently, right? So at least then people will know, okay, so this is the stage it's at, right? So I do think that some sort of awareness is important, and it doesn't matter how, right? So it could be, let's say, it could be a seminar, it could be maybe a notice literally on the beach or whatever. But I think that will sort of help us measure our own actions.
May I add that another perspective apart from regulation, awareness, all of that, is perhaps to look at native practices and practices that are more traditional. For instance, for a very long time in India, feasts and wedding feasts and meals, all of these were served on banana leaves. And it is not only eco-friendly, it's delicious, and several other practices. I remember for a very long time, everything in my house had at least 3 purposes. If it finished with one purpose, it was used somewhere else. If it finished with that, it was used somewhere else. And it's not for economic it's simply a part of the way in which we're taught this relationship with material things. So perhaps another approach parallelly would be to go back to these kinds of traditional practices. And we used to get milk in glass bottles, which would be no plastic sachets, all of those things. So that's another approach we can keep in mind, along with awareness and regulation.
No one-time use, yes, indeed.
Right. I wanted to ask what you guys might recommend as steps forward, other than writing and witnessing and getting the word out. How do we connect activism to the literary component?
Well, we need to make lifestyle changes for sure. That's number one. We need to go back, like Pervin was suggesting, this holistic living, right? Our parents practiced it without any effort. And about the literary aspect of, see, nowadays actually eco poetry is in the air. It's the contemporary thing to do. Most people are writing about it. And it's very good. There's nothing wrong with that. But I would be very happy if people really cared about what they're writing and not writing literary, eco poetry, or environmental stuff just for the sake of being on that wagon. That's number one. And also, I have a very interesting observation to share with all of you. It's that earlier, when people and poets wrote about nature, it was a kind of a glorification of nature. It was this going ooh and ah about it, how wondrous nature is. And now, in the last 10 years, if you observe, it's more like reclaiming that aspect of nature. Where is it all gone? So that's one paradigm shift in our perceptions. And poets are now questioning that whole thing, that where is that nature that you spoke about, let's say that Byron wrote about or Yeats wrote about? Where is all of that? So that's one important shift that's taken place. That's a perceptive thing. And I think it's also a kind of a result of the losses that the environment has undergone. So somebody else can answer.
Yeah, I think activism is sort of like starting small and starting with something that you love. I think finding a connection with nature is more important, right? It's it goes against, let's say, if you're sort of, if it's a mandatory thing, you have to do this, right? Sometimes it's the reverse psychology that works. It's like when you're told in school, by teachers, you're not supposed to do something, and then you're tempted to do that, right? But so I do think that it's important for us to care on a very personal level or a deeper level, like for example, how I had this connection with water and collecting shells, and sort of it started with that. I think it can start very small, right? I mean, you need not make bigger, like with large statements, you need not go out of the way to do sort of, it can start small. So, just an example. So, I live around mangroves. There's a huge mangrove, just surrounded my house, and I often look for events that happen around here, right? So it's, I mean, very close to home, like literally close to home, and there are sort of these mangrove cleaning drives that happen occasionally. I do hope that it happens more often. But what I mean is sometimes it might be just things around you, starting small or starting with something that you like, where there's passion. I think that will be great. Yeah.
May I just
Yes, absolutely.
the indigenous people have a lot to teach us in this exercise of generating awareness and learning how to live holistically. And in my foreword, I do mention how important it is to learn from the indigenous people. Whatever they took from nature, they gave the whole thing back to nature again, back to earth again. That's why there was no waste created, and that's why those areas are still pristine and well preserved, and they have something we admire. That whole indigenous lifestyle is what I'm getting at. And the other thing is also in my anthology, when you talked about how do you add this to literary poetry and activism together. I didn't want this anthology to be a dry, fact filing of all these issues. I wanted it to have that creative element. I wanted it to have the flourish of the pen and of the heart and mind. That was like the only filter I used when I collected all these poems for the anthology. That was really, really very important. And when we talk about science coming into poetry, but we have to do it creatively, we have to do it in a way that is poetic, literary. Those things cannot, the craft cannot be sacrificed.
Just to, sorry, may I?
Please.
Just to continue what Vinita was saying, an approach that works for me is to leave the categories and the labels and the themes aside for editors or for much later drafts, and to first be honest to the piece of writing as a literary exercise. For me, it is I'm first a poet, and then all of these ideas or themes. It's very easy for us to get classified as a feminist writer or somebody who's working in eco poetry, and it's very easy to then start playing to that label. So for me, I'm very conscious about letting all of that come from someone else or from an editor. Even for this anthology, I think I sent Vinita 3 poems, and they were not written to this call. They were written as part of the ideas that I'm preoccupied by, because we do not want our writers, activists, our activist writers. This is an interesting space, and for me, my first loyalty is to the literary merit of that work, rather than its thematic or its political content.
Sorry, I started speaking before I unmuted myself. That's great, Purvan. I think I would partly agree. I think if you want to be an activist, there's no shortage of ways to do that. Like, there's no shortage of activist groups to join and political groups to get involved in. And there's so many great movements to get stuck into. And I feel like, in a way, like, we're here as poets talking about eco-poetics. I maybe just to relitigate what I said earlier, like, poetry is a way to, like, look very deeply within oneself as well as out into the world, and kind of try and understand things and try and connect with feelings. And I think if you value that in and of itself and commit to that, and also know it can be really hard and really sad if you're thinking about species dying and, like, capitalism fucking breaking everything, which is what is happening, like, it's hard and sad and terrible stuff. But doing justice to that and honoring that, and finding solace within that, you will then hopefully be able to be a better human in your day job or with your activist hat on or anything like that, right? So I sort of feel like there's value in the writing and the reading of the poetry that will then go on to make you do a better job without there having to be a direct line as such.
There's a question in the chat from a woman with a very interesting last name, Deedle Tomlinson. And she's asking about the difficulty of communicating without sounding alarmist. And Tom has the interesting response: I don't have a problem with anyone sounding alarmist, myself included. I just want to, if I can add to that and see what you guys think, and not to make this parochial, but I keep thinking about, the difficulty here in America of talking to at least 30% of the population that support Donald Trump. I see him as, the side of the nature killers, the wreckers. That's a very large percentage of the dangerously ignorant that we probably can't make progress with unless we make some kind of peace with. Somehow we need to lower that percentage. I have, quick, violent solutions, but they go against my principles. What else can we do? And it's the same thing, I think, with the environment. How do we engage without ending the conversation as soon as it begins? So any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm of the view that there's no problem in being an alarmist, and I think it's too late to be laid back. The water's over our heads now, metaphorically speaking, and we need to raise these alarms. And poetry is already such a subtle art that we can't allow it to get any more laid back or any more subtle than it is. And we have to speak it the way it is, speak it out the way it is, and tell it like it is. And there are various other ways of activism. There's the street activism. There's this entire organized activism against climate change, which is very, very important. And I feel they're doing a more vital role than us poets writing about it. But if I was to limit my answer to this literary activism, I would say we cannot help but be alarmists. There's no way out.
Well, I think it's also worth trying to probe or bring into question the sources of the polarization. In so many countries now, the political polarization, the stratification of economic groups, and so on and so forth. What's really underneath that? Fear, refusal of what you're suggesting we, put in front of people. I mean, I think there's a way that poetry and writing can help people, can help challenge the things that people are clinging to, that they're not even aware that they're clinging to. Supports which really don't support, right? Illusory supports. A belief in a world which is more static than the world that we actually live in, some ways of challenging outdated ways of looking.
May I just quickly add that wherever there is hope, that hope also needs to be highlighted. So we are not being negative as a policy. We want to be positive, and if there is something to be hopeful about, we need to highlight that in all its strength. And also, I have another thing to share here is that there are, so many of these young people, the millennials, they consider this like dooms. The world is doomed, and they don't want to have children because they don't want to bring kids into a world that's already doomed. So I feel there's a great urgent and very urgent need for sociological studies on the impact of what is being articulated in the world of climate activism, climate change. So everybody gets the real picture, not just the picture of doom and negativity. That's also important.
Yeah. The idea of hope came up in the chat. Eve Stafford writes from, I think, very close to the Great Barrier Reef, that the answer to the question of doom versus hope is that you have to have hope in order to act. And, you know, I understand now that there are projects involving training corals to grow in water that's hotter than its natural habitat. It's actually working, apparently. And I've seen projects with growing corals away from the reef that's damaged or viral. And you see these eerie images of corals dangling from crosses in the water. A lot of positive results. On the other hand, it seems like so little, so late. So I feel that alarmist impulse as well. I'm not sure I'm so hopeful about the hopeful news. But maybe you guys are. And one of the things that Ravi had established as a tradition in the ISO break is to conclude with a message either of hope or encouragement. And that can include something connected to the work that you're doing right now, or something that you've read recently, or a writer that you feel really contributes to the issues of ecopoetics that we all might benefit from. So maybe I can start with Michelle. Do you want to take that first, and then we'll just work around the gallery?
Yes, sure. I'd like to recommend two writers, not really poets, but two writers' works that really had a lasting impression on me. So the first one is, the Indian writer Amitav Ghosh. I'm sure everyone's aware of his work. We interviewed him, on our podcast for The Nutmeg's Curse. It's one of those books that really made me think about the environment. It talks about colonialism and the sort of effect, sort of humans have had on the environment, on the earth over the years, right? Over like centuries old. And another writer that I like to recommend is Sejal Mehta. So she's written this really beautiful book called Superpowers on the Shore. And it just, people who love nature, people who love just, reading about wildlife. Like, let's say, you've just grown up watching Nat Geo's documentaries, just looking at, wildlife. I think they would love reading this book because it sort of brings about your passion for the environment. It brings about your passion for wildlife, and it just makes you appreciate the beauty all the more. So yeah, these two books.
Great. And could you put those in the chat, Michelle?
Yes, sure.
Great. Thank you. And that's one of the questions as well. Great. How about Tom?
Yeah, I'm not much of a hope guy. Sorry. So I'm researching doomsday preppers and survivalists and climate activism and subcultures of imminent collapse stuff at the moment. So yeah, I do fine without hope, and maybe that's something to be hopeful about. I don't think being hopeless or alarmist, personally, or in a lot of people I've talked to, is something that actually is demotivating or paralyzing. I think it's fine. And yeah, in terms of books, I did read a really lovely book by an Irish writer called Mark O'Connell, which is called Notes from an Apocalypse. I'll put it in the chat. Notes from an Apocalypse, A Personal Journey to the End of the World and Back. Written and published just before the pandemic. His final chapter tries to be hopeful. It's not very convincing. I mean, his answer is basically like, the world is still a very interesting place, even if it's falling apart. And but I think there's something in that in terms of like, for me, just the fact that we're all still here now, and that there is the life that there is right now, I find really, really important. I feel like getting too hung up in the future, it's important sometimes, but like, if you go out and sit in the forest by yourself for a couple of nights, and really just pay attention to the leaves and the soil and the beautifulness, and like start taking seriously the prospect that life goes on at very different timescales from us, and that entire bacterial civilizations can be born and flourish and die within a couple of days. That gives me so much hope in that even if we are going to screw everything terribly on a, say, 100-year timescale, there is so much living that's going to go on in the next 100 years. You know, on these microscopic levels. Talked to a great Maori writer in New Zealand who said something similar about, you know, like a tree is a whole world, you know, like, and whole life scope. And so that's the kind of place where I get hope, without expecting that to translate to things getting better for us humans. I don't know if that's helpful.
Great. I love it. I do find without hope, that could be a tattoo. And I love the tree as a world as well. Thank you, Tom. Mary, how about you?
I think, you know, there are too many for me to come up with this time of night. I like Alice Oswald, her Dart, with the mixture of all the creatures and the different voices. She sort of spent 2 years interviewing people and bringing another life, for one. And Elizabeth Bledsoe, it's kind of interesting. I mean, you know, there's so many interesting writers from a craft point of view. And anyway, I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, thank you. If you want, yeah, you can put those names in the chat so others might be able to track down a couple of writers we're not familiar with. Pervin?
Yes, so I have 2 points and 2 perspectives on this. One is that I think there is no hope versus alarmist. I think it's hope all around, because if we do act on time and if we do act well, things will improve. And if we don't act on time, all of those consequences, and perhaps we will be wiped out, which is actually good for our planet. So things will improve. So this idea of identifying so closely with the individual first and then with your own species, I think if we move beyond that and we really think of nature and the ecology for itself and not for how it is good or bad for us, I think there is hope both ways. And the other thing that I wanted to address Tim's question about how do we reach out to groups that are so obviously on the other side of our beliefs and our politics. And I think that writing and poetry in particular is perfectly suited for it, because the relationship at that time is not from a podium, it's not from a stage, it's not facts, it's not lectures, but it is a story. It is a moment of you're sitting at home in the middle of the night, opening a page and listening to a writer talk about something deeply personal. And I think that moment of connecting with another human being, that is when our politics can dissolve. And I have seen people who would never call themselves, for instance, feminists. I have seen, out of love, for them to do things that all of us would classify as feminists, though they will not use that label for them. They're doing it for love, not for ideology. So I think love is the answer. If we're able to find that connection with another human being, I think we will be able to reach them. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, and I'm thinking too, when you say it might be a good thing for the planet if we were wiped out, my immediate impulse was go orcas. That's one of the more encouraging stories, I think, of eco crises. How about coming full circle back to Vinita? Whoops, we have the mute on.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Before I share my perspectives and answer your question, there's something buzzing in my mind ever since you mentioned that somebody asked about Kunjana Parashar's poem about playing those sounds and where can they read the poem. So I wanted to share that Pervin had read it from the anthology itself. It's a part of Count Every Breath. So that's that. And regarding how we can actually make a difference and what can we do to promote a better earth and a better environment and a better ecology, I would say that it's very important that all of us pick up a hobby that is centered around nature. I myself am a birder, and anything you could get interested in bees, just be observant about the things happening around your immediate environs, whether there are trees, notice when do those trees flower, when do they shed leaves, are they male trees, are they female trees? So that kind of personal deep involvement with whatever you are noticing in your environment is a very important thing to do. And regarding books, I feel Pascal Petit's Mama Amazonia is just great. She's the perfect person to bring creativity to eco writing, eco poetry. She's just so good at it. I really admire her book, Mama Amazonia. And also in the realm of nonfiction, Peter Wohlleben, he's very good. His books are such enriched, very well researched, treasure troves of knowledge of nature. And also, I would recommend, and this might sound a little bizarre and archaic, but I would recommend people read Kalidas's Meghdut. It's a very ancient Indian literature that goes back more than 1,000 years, and in which he's written that living in Kashmir, but his beloved lives in the heart of India, which is central India, which is very close to where I live, in a place called Ujjain. So he addresses a cloud and sends that cloud with a message to his beloved, and the cloud passes over all over, almost half of India, and it's like a pan scenario of the nature that India enjoyed in those days. So I know we're talking about climate change, but that's not climate change. It is pure nature poetry. But sometimes you need to inspire yourself with pure nature poetry and discover what can be regained, by addressing climate change. Maybe we can go back and I come from a position of hope for sure. Yes, I come from a position of hope. Even though I would say, yes, alarmists are very much in, but yes, I do have hope. The tiger census in India has gone up terrifically. We've done well in the tiger sector. Let's see what happens.
Okay. Well, I take hope from the work that all of you are doing. I take hope from the great anthology you've put together, and from so many of the suggestions that you guys have made tonight, and that I see in the chat as well. I want to thank you guys for coming out and spending this time with us. It's been an illuminating, entertaining evening. And even though I think I'm on the Tom end of alarmism over hope, I feel like I'm walking away with Deedle is encouraging me to self-promote. I'll have a book coming out toward the end of the year called Listening to Fish, and it's really coming out of my dive experiences and my great alarm at what I see happening underwater. It's frightening and deeply sad. I don't think there's a moment when you engage nature that you're not experiencing both awesome beauty and sadness at the same time. This is the way I enter into it, certainly when I go in the water. But tonight was a moment of, I think, hope and joy rather than alarm and terror. Thank you so much, guys. There it is. Count Every Breath, a climate change anthology. Wonderful collection available on Amazon. I had to dig around a little bit for that. So everybody be patient. If you don't see it today, it'll be there very soon if you're purchasing in North America. We'll do, I think we'll be doing another broadcast in maybe 8 weeks, 10 weeks. We'll see. In the meantime, please keep in touch with New York Writers Workshop at newyorkwritersworkshop.weebly.org and with AP Writers at apwriters.org. Again, a shout out to Robbie Shanker for coming up with this. I want to thank Sally Breen for all the great work she's doing with AP Writers. See you guys hopefully very soon in the real world. Virtually for now. Thanks so much.
Thank you, APWT and Sally and Tim.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Congratulations,
much.
Lisa.
Okay. Bye-bye. Ending the broadcast. Ciao.